If this is like a trivia, I'm really bad at trivia, so this is I'm so bad at it. I don't know. So I'm Kelly, the middle page on Instagram, and I write and talk about Tolkien and help people gain a better understanding of his work. My very first encounter with Tolkien was when my father read me The Hobbit, and then very shortly after The Lord of the Rings. And this was right before the movies came out. And I think to this day, like my dad really wanted to make sure that if his kid was going to like Tolkien, that they were going to know the book first, which there's no right or wrong way to approach Tolkien for the first time. But I think he really wanted to pass on that love for the written word to me, and it worked. So so my dad read me the Hobbit and then the Lord of the Rings, and I actually couldn't wait for him to finish it. So I finished the Return of the King myself, and I remember being so devastated when Gandalf died and I didn't know what happened, right? And I went in and I went to my dad's bookshelf and I opened up the Two Towers and I saw the words Gandalf said, and I was like, oh, I just spoiled myself. But then I was also just like, oh my God, thank you. I'm so glad. And so I remember I had to keep that secret. I was like, didn't tell my dad that I knew that somehow Gandalf was in the future. Um, because Gandalf like was my favorite character and is still one of my favorite characters. But yeah, so I was just a little kid, and then we saw the movies shortly after, and that just solidified my love for Tolkien. That never looked back. Yes, 100%. It influenced the rest of my life, the whole where my life took me, because I fell in love with reading and the written word through Tolkien, for sure. And I loved reading, and I went through high school, uh, being pretty good at school, but like having this love for fantasy. And when I started college, I didn't know it's like I'll go in undeclared and I'll just, maybe I'll study creative writing, maybe I'll study like photography. I was definitely always like leaned to the arts, and I knew that I wasn't going to be some scientist or anything like that. But after my first year of college, I spent the summer like reading like Jane Austen and like all of these like classics. And I was like, wait a second, if I in my free time spent my summer after my first year of college just reading books, I think I just want to do English literature. And so I did, and I kind of, I know that the joke is like, oh, you'll do nothing with your English major. Um, but I just wanted to do something that I loved doing. So I started taking literature classes, and I just adored reading and writing and thinking about books, and I loved every single class. I loved writing the essays. I loved everything. um, so I graduated with a literature degree. Ended up working in kind of somewhat the field, and when I think was thinking about grad school, because again I just loved what I did and I wanted to do more of it, and I really started thinking about like, but I have these two sides to me. I have my English literature that I read for school, and then my fun fantasy books, and why are they so separate? I was always sacrificing one for the other. And it always felt like, okay, I have to put like the Game of Thrones reading on hold when I'm working on English literature for the semester, and vice versa. And then I started listening to Corey Olson's podcast where he was looking at the Silmarillion and he was looking at The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings. And I was like, oh my gosh, I think I could write like a thesis on Tolkien. That would be so cool. Um, so I started off my graduate school just kind of with the same university that I had gone to, and kind of I abandoned it after the first semester for Signum University. So I started attending a Signum University that focused on Tolkien and fantasy, and got my master's that way. So I never looked back from that too. And then from there, everything I do in my spare time like nowadays is pretty much revolved around studying Tolkien and reading literature and having this community that I have on the internet and everything that has become like such a community and these people who have become very real friends. And so my life today looks so different than it would if I had never been that little kid where my dad was reading The Lord of the Rings when I was just a little girl, so yeah, so definitely changed my career just because I think there's so much what that Tolkien does to inspire the love of language and the love of literature, and it really worked on me. Yes, so I studied Anglo-Saxon and I studied Old Norse, and I really, really loved both. Um, I unfortunately don't remember a lot of it, but, I really wanna go back and, it's like kind of like a one day that I have to make sure that it's someday soon if I wanna actually do it, but one day I do wanna revisit Anglo-Saxon and really kind of wrap my head around learning it, like, in a very real way, because I remember being like when I was just a little undergrad, and like my very first English course, just being like, it would be so cool to read Beowulf in the original language. And I eventually, through my studies with Tolkien, and I eventually started translating some Beowulf, and it would take years at the length that I was spending on it. Um, but it was so cool to say, like, yeah, I was translating some Beowulf, and, it was really, really fun. So I really liked both, and I will say Old Norse was definitely easier after taking Anglo-Saxon. Having that foundation of what those old languages look like, really helped. So I wanted an outlet to because I loved what I was doing in school. So I started the middle page like a decade ago, like a long time ago, and it started off as like a more like a blog. And I really wanted to I had all these ideas. I was so inspired by what I was reading and especially inspired by reading and writing and thinking about fantasy that I just wanted a space to write down those thoughts that I had that they wouldn't become papers. They wouldn't, be something that I turned into a professor. But they were things that I just wanted to write about for myself and share with others. So I started as a blog, and way back in like 2013, like way back when, I just did the next natural thing was to start like an Instagram account for it. And of course, social media looks very different now than it did 10 or so years ago. Um, and I just sort of like used my account on and off based on what I was doing with school and like life because life just, happens. And so I was kind of like in it, kind of out of it. And I was out of it for like definitely a few years there. Probably like 3, 4, or 5 years, kind of just like fell away from it and I still had this account. And then in 2022, when, Rings of Power was going to start, I just thought, you know, I I want to share what I know about Tolkien, and I especially wanted to be a woman in the space because even at that time, that was just a few years ago, but there just wasn't a lot of women. And I know that they're around, and I know that we are such a strong part of Tolkien fandom and readership. And there's still, it seemed to be a little bit male dominated. And I was like, I want to be a voice here. And since then, there are so many cool, awesome women creators, um, and I'm just one of them. And it's the coolest thing, and honestly, the best thing about creating a page and just connecting with fellow women who love Tolkien, have similar experiences of just kind of being not taken very seriously throughout their life because of their love of Tolkien. Like, yeah, yeah, but your brother got you into it, right? Your boyfriend likes it. And it's like, no, no, I got my boyfriend into it, like that sort of thing. And so being able to connect with that, but then also being able to connect with the way that Tolkien writes his characters, and um, it's been so cool. So it's been a really long journey for me, but only in the past few years has it been something that's really been part of my everyday life. Oh, like Fellowship, Two Towers, or Return of the King? Mm, that's hard. Oh my gosh. I think probably Return of the King. Fellowship is Fellowship is it's a pretty strong tie between the two. But I think like I'm such a sucker for like beginnings and endings. I think there's so much that like Fellowship of the Ring, there's a lot that Tolkien was like figuring out as he was writing, and like I think a modern day editor wouldn't have let a lot of that fly. They would be cutting Tom Bombadil. They would be cutting the stuff that like the movie cut. But Tolkien was figuring it out, and the story kind of really hits home at when they get to Rivendell. Um, but I love all that stuff. I love that. But there's so much in Return of the King that all of the build up, what Tolkien does with hope and despair and love and, you know, the long defeat of evil is so strong in The Return of the King that it's just one of my favorite books to revisit. It's guaranteed to make you cry. Out of, of all three, The Return of the King, you're gonna cry the most because you're gonna feel the most. Any book. Lord of the Rings is the easy answer, but I don't want to say that because that is such a good annual like reread. I it's I, does On Fairy Stories count? On Fairy Stories is probably my most after kind of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, my most reread of his works, because it's just as a lover of reading and writing about fantasy, I think it's so interesting to see what Tolkien said about writing fantasy and the history of fairy stories and what was important about writing and reading fairy stories and fantasy. To have this established, he's the father of fantasy, and to have this person write his own thoughts and feelings about fantasy and fairy stories as a genre and why it's important and why it's not just for kids is such a special thing. So I would say that is extremely rereadable. And it's beautiful writing in and of itself, even though it's this, lecture turned essay, because it says a lot about um, his own work. I'm so bad at favorites, so this is going to be so fun. I'm really bad at favorites. I think Frodo. Yeah, I think there's a lot of resilience in him, and I think his journey is some of the most interesting. I don't always think he's the most fun to read about, like in terms of like if you want to feel like joy and fun and like there's obviously like the Pippin and Merry of it all. Although Merry is also like his own wisdom and strength in friendship is so admirable. And of course, Sam. I don't need to even say anything about Sam. Everybody loves him. But Frodo's resilience and his loyalty and his he does have some jokes. He does have some little jokes here and there. But I think he is the most interesting character to think about deeply. Silmarillion, probably Luthien. I do love my girls. Um, I love her story. I think she is so freaking cool. The fact that she rescues herself, befriends her captor's dog, and that dog is like, me and you, girl, like, um, and then saves her boyfriend. Like she and like faces Sauron. She is the coolest person, and I think that her strength is not something that you see in a sword or in battle. Her strength is, she like lulls, you know, Morgoth or Sauron, I can't remember, to sleep. Like she's like dances for him, and he falls asleep. I just think that she's one of the most beautiful characters, not just for like how she's described as beautiful, but like um, in everything that she does to choose her life and how she wants to live it and the person really that she chose to be with. And just, I think she's awesome. I don't have one. I don't have one. Because I am not, I mean, I'll say the weapon that Eowyn uses to kill the Witch King, because I love that, or that and um, the knife that Mary has. But I am not I don't have any weapons that I've, like, really, like, am drawn to. I'm like, "Okay, that's a cool sword," and then I move on. Um, so I don't have one, but I will say, I do really, really love the way that Tolkien talks about weapons. It's not this cool badass thing for, like, badass sake. It's wrapped up in legend and myth and history, and even, in The Hobbit, um, the fact that they get there's these old ancient weapons and they find out that they are, from Gondolin, and there's history and myth wrapped up in it to the point where when Bilbo, kills his first spider, he names his sword. When he actually uses Sting for the first time, he decides to name it, and in doing so, he kind of puts himself into that mythic, legendary world full of heroes. And so I do really like the way that Tolkien talks about swords and weapons of being this grand thing that's not special because it kills. It's special because of not just a tool, it's the heroes that wielded them and what those people did with it. So I do love when Tolkien talks about swords like that. I think I think one of the things I love talking about is Tolkien's own inspirations for some of this Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And I've talked about this, and I always kind of like go back to this, but I really love looking at his inspirations for goblins and the orcs. And so it surprises me when people don't know this, but he was inspired a lot by The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald, which is a kid's book. And his on and off again relationship with goblins written by George MacDonald is really interesting because when he was younger, he loved the way that goblins were written about from this other writer, and talked about like by that standard, I judge any new goblins or old. It's like what he says. He had a goblin standard that he held it. He held his own goblins to it, and he said outright that he was inspired by George MacDonald, and you can see that in his works. They have a lot of similarities. They were both, driven underground. They don't like the sun. They um, were once human. If you want to think about his orcs being once elves, kind of twisted and manipulated into being a different kind of race, and they're just kind of evil creatures that like using industrial things to get their way. So his goblins are really interesting in The Hobbit, and of course he develops them in The Lord of the Rings. And goblins and orcs are the same, but orcs are kind of viewed a little bit differently. And then later in life, Tolkien really hated George MacDonald. He thought he was really pedantic. He thought he wasn't subtle at all, and he didn't like he was asked to write, I believe it was a foreword to one of George MacDonald's books, and he started writing it, and he was like, "I think I hate him. I think I hate this." So much so that he was inspired to write what became The Smith of Wootton Major. Because he's like, I'm going to write my own fairy story, and I think this is what it's going to be like. So that's a really fun tidbit because it's so like we have the receipts of Tolkien like loving this person and then being like, nah, I never really liked him, and like, actually, you didn't know this, but we actually have, we would have someday have all of your, letters and stuff saying how much you love this guy. I would be an elf, because I am 5'2". So in real life, I'm already a hobbit, but I would love nothing more to be an elf in Rivendell, reading histories and books. And, um, I'm not a big foodie, like I love a good, I love me a good pizza or something, but I'm not a big food person. But I do really love, my coffees and my books. And like, I just think if I were an elf, I would be in Rivendell, sitting by the fire, reading poetry and sipping my little elven wine. Um, and that is my ideal place in Middle Earth. Wouldn't Gondolin would be so cool, especially because it was so secretive and so hidden and so special. Of course, I would never be able to leave if I went to Gondolin, and that means I would be there for the great fall of it. So maybe not that, but if I were just gonna like, visit, I feel like I would want to see Gondolin in all of its glory. I think that would be really cool. But also, I mean, the forests, like maybe like Fanghorn Forest when it was early days, just starting, and the Ents were kind of just like moving there, maybe. I feel like that'd be really cool before everything, happens, or like Mirkwood before everything happens. Middle Earth early days forests would also be like a close second. I really loved reading about the First Age. It's really, really cool. For a long time, I wasn't really into the Second Age. I really wasn't into the Numenorian stuff, and I really credit like Rings of Power for getting me there because the Numenorian stuff, I really kind of was like, all it really is like a long list of kings, and yeah, I just didn't really. It was so in a world of like hobbits and elves and like history of men wasn't really for some reason wasn't really interested in it. But then being able to have like a foundation and a ground, like the way that I was able to have like character faces to names, um, really helped me be like, oh, I really am interested in what went on in the Second Age. Um, But I think the First Age stuff is so interesting, especially because that's what Tolkien was thinking about in his early days writing. But even before he wrote The Hobbit, he was thinking about this land of fairy. It's very much fairy when he was writing it when he was like 19, 20 years old. He thought of them as fairies, not necessarily elves yet, and you could really see that in some of the First Age stuff. I think if there's a good one from Lord of the Rings. It's funny, Pete just did a video on this, but Baragond, I love him, and his love for Faramir is what saves his life, saves Faramir's life. I really, really like when Pippin gets to know the people of Gondor and that Baragond's one of them. I really like him. I feel like I wish we had more of Melian because I think she's so interesting, and maybe I really like her because I only have little, glimpses of her. I want to know why she liked Thingol so much. I think that'd be really interesting to get her point of view. Yeah, I'm trying to think. It'd be really cool to know a little bit more about all of the dwarves in The Hobbit too. Like I think in if Tolkien ever really really revisited The Hobbit, I think he would have backstories for all of them. And really, I think Thorin would be a really interesting character to see more character development because he's obviously so in The Hobbit. He's like struggling with the loss of his family, the loss of his home, and he's written a little simply because again it's a children's book, but there's so much going on with like internally. There's got to be so much going on internally with what he's facing and what he wants to do. And I think if we got a little bit more of him, it would be just his last lines would be all the better. They're already so good, um, but it'd be cool to see him like fully fleshed out. Oh, probably Boromir. In terms of what people have seen with the films, I don't know if that's exactly what you're thinking of, but I think there's a lot of misunderstanding going on with Boromir, and a little thinking of him a little bit more in like a one-dimensional, like he was part of the Fellowship, he was a man, and he lusted after the ring, like, and then it's just that's it, right? But there is a lot more depth to him and his story, and um, yeah, he's not a villain. Like he did a bad thing. But he's not a villain per se. I don't think if there's anyone else, but that's definitely the first one that comes to mind. I, I think Gandalf or Niena. Um, and they go hand in hand because of course they spend a lot of time together. Um, but I do think Gandalf's wisdom, but I don't think he always applies it like I think there's a lot of wisdom that he has that he doesn't pass on to other people. Um, because if he did, everybody would be making the right, the right choices, and then you wouldn't have a story. You wouldn't have the ups and downs and trials and tribulations of what the Fellowship go through. So it makes sense. But he is very wise. I think Aragorn is also very, very wise. I think there's a lot, we typically think of elves and Elrond, and there's wisdom in all of the elves and what they, because they live so long, they accumulate so much wisdom, and they're able to see mankind and what they, everything that we do wrong, right? Um, but there is such a wisdom to Aragorn throughout Lord of the Rings, that I really admire. And it's really applicable wisdom. Like some of the stuff that he says is really applicable to how we act in our the very real world, and how we approach other people and approach situations. So I think Aragorn doesn't always get talked about as being wise, but he is. Yeah, all the time. I think, like, particularly with the Silmarillion, so much of your first couple read throughs is trying to just grasp everything that's going on. And even if you're not trying to know every single character, just trying to make sure that you understand, like, the bare minimum. I'll say when I reread the Silmarillion, my wow moments are almost always revolved around the way that Tolkien has written the sentence. I almost always forget how beautiful his writing is. If there's any poetry, I always forget how wonderful it is to hear. He wanted, when early days, he wanted to be a poet more than anything, and he was. Undeniably a good poet, but they're almost always surrounded about, like, wow, that was a beautifully crafted sentence. Is my most wow moments of like, wait, I'm gonna reread that again. That was beautiful. And you forget that in how action packed it can be. Like, even like battle scenes, he wrote battle scenes very beautifully. Um, and so that's by far the thing that I experience the most when I reread. I'm trying to think if that's probably it. Yeah. I, I did this with Rings of Power. When season two came out, it was in the fall, and I made myself a little pumpkin latte, for every single episode, because I was like, I want to have my pumpkin latte. I want to watch the episode. So I did have a very particular thing for Rings of Power season two. For the movies, no, I don't have a particular snack. I do I do love pairing my favorites with favorites, though. So, like, if I'm going to do, like, I'm gonna do like a Lord of the Rings night, like, I'm gonna have like nachos. Like, I love my favorite little snack is nachos. So I'll just do like all of my favorite things to make it just like such a fun, like, night. So I'll do that pretty much. I don't throw a lot of parties, but I do make sure to do the Tolkien toast on his birthday, January 3rd. I make sure to do that. So I love that little tradition. It's a way to think about him as a person, first and foremost, on his birthday. So I do that every year. I think, yeah, everything else is pretty random. So I read a ton of modern fantasy. I read a lot. Uh, Part of my day job is very involved with books and like publishing, and so I read a lot of modern fantasy. Actually, today one of my favorite books of the year comes out. It's called The Everlasting by Alex Harrow, and it is about a knight and a scholar falling in love throughout time over and over again. Um, but I generally really like books that are retellings. I really like Morgan is My Name by Sophie Keach. This is a retelling of Morgan Le Fay of Arthurian literature, but told from her point of view. In a similar vein, one of my favorite authors is Madeline Miller, who wrote Circe. Again, it's Circe's point of view in her isolation, on her island, and her kind of complex feelings about being part of two worlds as a demigoddess. So I really like retellings. I like soft magical characters, and I really like when women are writing about those characters because I think we get a fresh perspective. That's sort of what I read. I think people usually expect me to say George R. R. Martin and Brandon Sanderson after Tolkien, but it's not really the case. I think they're great. I love reading Game of Thrones, and I've read a couple of Brandon Sanderson books. But I generally lean towards more like softer fantasy nowadays. It is wild to me anytime somebody recommends the Silmarillion first. And it's also wild that anybody I've gotten people who say that's how the first thing they read from Tolkien was the Silmarillion, and I am so impressed. Um, that is last always for me. For The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, I really think that you could approach either. Given especially like it just so much depends on your own experience with Tolkien so far, your age, your interest level. If you've seen the movies 10,000 times but haven't read The Hobbit, I'm going to say read The Hobbit first. Like, if you've never, like, you've already experienced one story, even if it's not the way that Tolkien wrote it, like, I would say start with The Hobbit and then go right into Lord of the Rings. But if you aren't really gravitate if you don't find yourself being gravitated towards children's stories, and you want to hop into the deep the world building, the characters that you love, if you just love the story and you want more of the Lord of the Rings story, I think you could easily start with Lord of the Rings, go to the Hobbit, and then do Silmarillion. But generally speaking, I do list the Hobbit first, just because that is there wouldn't be Lord of the Rings without The Hobbit. Not at all. And I love reading and thinking about when I read like things in order, I really like reading the order that the author thought of them and wrote them, even if eventually chronologically within the world things are different. So, I mean, I guess I can't say that too strong because at that point I would be saying some of the similar stuff first because he did write some of that. Um, but you can't really approach unfinished, or you can't approach like Unfinished Tales or the History of Middle Earth, like Book of Lost Tales stuff is his earliest stuff. But you can't read Book of Lost Tales as your first Tolkien. Like that would be wild. Um, but yeah, I do. I think there's when he was writing The Hobbit, like it's just so different from when he was thinking about Lord of the Rings. So it's really fun to start there. If I had the opportunity to ask him one question, I'm so bad at, I don't know if I have one. I would just want to watch him work. I would just want, where was Gondor when the Westfold fell? I would probably, I'd have to think. I don't have one off the top of my head, I think. But I think I would want to ask him, I would think I would want to look at some of his women characters and ask him a question about that. Because I think that um, is such an it's so easy to think because he did write mostly men, like that is um, obviously the case. Um, but the women that he did write are so interesting, fascinating, and some of them are really well developed in the Silmarillion. And I would want to probably ask him more about that and get his like true opinion words on some of the women that he wrote, because I think that these are some of the most misunderstood characters, or people think that he brushed them aside. And I think I would want to maybe ask more about Eowyn, because I myself am conflicted. Eowyn's one of my favorite characters, but she's complex because her turn at the end towards healing and putting away the sword is so important to her character and so important in the world of peace that the Return of the King is entering. But it is also such an interesting one. You know, does she do it just for love? Does she do it for herself? It's complicated, and there definitely are readers who are also torn by this. It's like she loses a little bit of what made her so, I guess, more modern in terms of like doing what she wanted, and going against just what people wanted her to do just because she was a woman. And then she kind of just falls back into that at the end of the book. So it's almost like a betrayal if you were like, yeah, Eowyn is so cool. She does like whatever she wants. She's gonna ride into battle. She's gonna defeat the Witch King. And then it's like at the end she kind of does what everybody wanted her to do in the first place. But of course she had to do those things to get there. But there's lots of complications around her character, and there's lots of, I think, questions I would have on some of the characters that he wrote about. But yeah, I don't have my like one question that I'd ask him. It's so hard to choose. Yeah, I do. I haven't really voiced this out loud to anybody, but I'm happy to share it. Because I also have a Substack, which kind of is like the blog for 2025. Because my old blog kind of fell away, and then but I still love writing, and I still when I do write about Tolkien, like there is such a I feel like more myself. I feel more at home with what I'm doing. It just is a hobby that it makes me feel so good. And I love doing it. So I want to write more about Tolkien on my Substack, and I want to do some book clubs. I want to do maybe, I thought about starting something in the new year where people can subscribe to me and do like a year of Tolkien reading, which wouldn't include The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, or The Silmarillion because people usually read those. And other people are doing those read alongs and they're doing it great. But it would include works like On Fairy Stories, Smith of Wooten Major, some of his medieval stuff, like all of this stuff that people know exists but don't really know what to do with, at least not the casual fan, I'd say. So if I do want to do this for 2026, I do have to get the ball rolling. But I think it'd be really cool to look at Tolkien's other works and it kind of bring those more like accessible to people. um, but even if I don't do that, I do plan on just, writing more Lord of the Rings, or writing more about Lord of the Rings. And when I finish my Hobbit annotation series, which is, the ends in sight for that, I'll probably will start annotating the Lord of the Rings. But it's going to be a long journey for that. But that's probably what I'll do next. Oh, that's a really good question. That's a really beautiful question too. Um, I would say I mean, the most important thing is your enjoyment of the text. Because it's not like what we were just saying, it's not about memorizing every name, every location, everything. It's not about becoming a master of Tolkien lore or anything like that. That means nothing. um, Tolkien wrote these stories because of what he was so inspired by the world around him, the nature surrounding him, the tales of ancient days, the mythologies, the languages. And so to read Tolkien without enjoyment of the text, the words, the story, is such a disservice. So I would say enjoy it, slow down, make sure you slow down enough to take in Tolkien's words, um, because they're beautiful. He wrote with intention. He really was a wordsmith. He studied languages first and foremost, and that shows. So if you speed yourself through it, and that also leads to the point of don't skip the poems and songs. If you're skipping those poems and songs, you are missing out not only on some of Tolkien's most beautiful writing, but also some of Tolkien's most like jovial writing, especially like when it's the hobbits that are singing. But you're also skipping out on like context and information about who is singing. So if elves are singing, you're going to get a lot of information about how elves view the world. Same with if men have a poem or song that they're reciting, you're going to learn a lot about their own history and what they view as important. Um, and you're also going to be missing out on something that Tolkien really felt a calling to much of his life, especially his early life. Poetry was what inspired him, and he wanted to be a poet first and foremost. So slow down enough to enjoy the words that Tolkien is writing would be my advice.